bridge the gap from a story and lore perspective between Cataclysm and Mist of Pandaria. However, from a visual perspective, I feel like we were really trying to strike a different chord.
Pandas have proven popular. World of Warcraft's Mist of Pandaria expansion sold 2.7 million units in its first week on sale, boosting the game's global subscriber base to over 10 million users.
The year is 2014, and the World of Warcraft is coming off of its first controversial expansion, the Cataclysm. While it's unfair to say that it was a bad expansion, it is fair to say that it was the first that wasn't almost unanimously praised for taking the game into this new and hopeful future, whereas its predecessors primarily only added to the world. Cataclysm was the first where much of its content was the removal or the streamlining of existing systems. The game had received a complete makeover functionally and also aesthetically as Deathwing ravaged over the old world, forever changing the original zones that had once captivated players. It was a jarring change, to say the least, and for some, a little bit too jarring. But little did they know, they hadn't seen anything yet. World of Warcraft's fourth expansion, the Mist of Pandaria, was announced at BlizzCon 2011 on October 21st to a stunned audience. The controversy began even before the trailer had finished, with many wondering if it was some kind of out-of-season April Fool's joke. And while some immediately disregarded it on aesthetics alone, others today look at it as this unique and memorable adventure into a new world. Join me for the next half hour as I explain why World of Warcraft's fourth expansion, the Mist of Pandaria, was controversial. But do you know what shouldn't be controversial? Taking proper care of your body and monitoring your nutrition with AG1. AG1 is this super simple, drinkable multivitamin. Being a World of Warcraft fan, you're well acquainted with daily quests. I just passed my 3-month streak myself. Just one scoop mixes up your daily multivitamins, pre- and probiotics, plus superfoods and antioxidants. It's an all-in-one habit that helps with energy, improves digestion, gut health, and fills in those sneaky nutrient gaps in your diet, and also supports your immune system. I know you can't tell by the voice, but I myself have felt a definite energy boost since I've started, and they've recently dropped some new flavors. My favorite is tropical. It has this refreshing and fruity vibe with hints of pineapple and citrus from plant-based sources, and most importantly, no added sugar or artificial sweeteners. It's like Stranglethorn Vale in a glass. If you're ready to try it out, head on over to my link or scan the QR code on the screen. When you subscribe, you'll get a free welcome kit worth $76, including 5 travel packs, a shaker, a canister, and a scoop to kickstart your own streak. But anyways, back to the video. By the time the announcement was made, expansions for the game were pretty widely understood, so it was unsurprising to learn that it would follow the footprint set by the previous 3, with a new level cap, new spells, a new world to explore, dungeons, raids. This was all quite standard and expected, but what wasn't expected was the setting, Pandaria. At this point, Azeroth was reeling from Deathwing's rampage. Not only did it shatter the world, it also destabilized the balance between the Alliance and the Horde. After Deathwing's defeat, the world entered this tense recovery. The dragon aspects, having now sacrificed their immortality to stop him, lost much of their power, and they left Azeroth's fate more firmly in mortal hands. By this time, Garrosh Hellscream, the son of Grommash Hellscream, rose from the conflicted Mag'har in Outland to the war chief of the Horde. This had been brewing since the beginning of the Wrath of the Lich King expansion, where Garrosh led the Warsong offensive in Northrend, and while he proved his prowess as the leader, he also clashed with advisors over his brashness. However, when the Cataclysm came, and Thrall focused his efforts more on shamanistic duties, he named Garrosh the acting war chief in the meantime, valuing his lineage and military record despite his inexperience as a leader. Eventually, Garrosh had dueled with Cairn Bloodhoof, and tainted by Magatha Grimtotem's poison, he secured his rule, but also alienated the non-orc factions like the Trolls and the Tauren. As war chief, his aggressive leadership had transformed Orgrimmar into a war machine and escalated Horde and Alliance tensions. His destruction of Theramore with a mana bomb marked this point of no return and intensified the war as the Cataclysm ended. As time went on, his ambition to dominate Azeroth intensified hostilities, and amidst this growing war, this mysterious continent, Pandaria, which was previously hidden by magical mists, was rediscovered when Alliance and Horde naval forces clashed with each other. The mists, which were maintained by the last Pandaren Emperor, Shaohao, had concealed Pandaria for millennia to protect it from external corruption. Their dissipation was triggered indirectly by Deathwing, and it exposed Pandaria to the Alliance versus Horde war. The continent's ancient inhabitants, the Pandaren, faced new threats as the conflict awakened the Sha, which were manifestations of negative emotions like anger and fear, and unleashed chaos. Garrosh's obsession with power led him to exploit Pandaria's resources and dark energies, and it set the stage for the expansion central conflict, which was the struggle to protect Pandaria's balance while the Alliance and Horde fought each other in all-out war. The announcement was met with raucous applause and enthusiasm from the live crowd, but social media told a different story, expressing confusion, disappointment, and, as is common with the MMO player base, anger. The aesthetics and world was so unexpected of what players were accustomed to within the Warcraft universe. Over the course of a decade, it was all about orcs, axes, violence, beer, and heavy metal. Players were just getting used to the complete makeover of the old world from Cataclysm, so to immediately follow this up with such a drastic change in aesthetic would be the main driving force of this divide that continues to follow Mists to this very day. Some immediately wrote it off completely, others proceeded cautiously, and the rest were eager for something new. But whatever the case, it's safe to say that at this point, the player base was the most split they had ever been, as Blizzard took a gamble that was somehow even bigger than the Cataclysm. But getting into the actual features of the expansion, beyond all of the standard stuff, similar to the Burning Crusade, Pandaria would see a new race added to the game, the Pandaren. And as shocking as their announcement was, the Pandaren weren't entirely new to Warcraft fans. In Warcraft 3, The Frozen Throne, players encountered Shen's Stormstout, a wandering Pandaren brewmaster with a love for adventure and a knack for brewing. Little did they know, however, this small cameo planted the seeds for an entire expansion. The Pandaren's culture was steeped heavily in East Asian-inspired philosophy. They valued harmony, emotional control, and living in sync with nature, which provided this stark contrast to the war that Garrosh brought to their shores, essentially serving as this narrative bridge from Cataclysm's destruction to Mists of Pandaria's exploration of peace versus war. To follow along with this renewed theme of the faction war, uniquely, players who picked the Pandaren would start off as neutral, and after a short questing campaign, and being given a taste of each faction, they would have to decide on which one to join, forcing players to grapple with the same choice that Pandaria faced: pick a side in a world that was tearing itself apart. The Pandaren would also be accompanied by the game's second new class, the Monk, which blended martial arts with mysticism. New races and classes certainly weren't new, but to have both in one expansion was certainly something unique with Mists. Once again inspired by East Asian martial arts traditions and possibly DreamWorks Kung Fu Panda, they fought with fists, feet, and weapons like staves, and they channeled energy called Qi to either heal, harm, or mitigate. They had 3 roles. The Brewmaster was the tank, using Drunken Brawling to stagger damage. Mistweaver was for healing, weaving mists to restore allies, and the Windwalker was for dealing damage with swift and acrobatic strikes, and having a similar resource system to the Rogue with energy and a point system, but at the same time still providing a unique and versatile experience. Exiting Pandaland for a moment and exploring some gameplay systems, the talent trees would once again see a pretty major overhaul. As you would know if you saw the previous episode, talents were already the recipient of some pretty major changes. Not only would they be trimmed down from their Wrath counterparts, they would also be much more restrictive, and they forced players to stick with just one specialization for the first 31 points before they were allowed to invest points into the other trees. This, combined with losing access to other spells that were unique to the other specializations, made for a much more identity-driven, if not streamlined experience. And in Mists, it was taken even further. In essence, instead of many minor tweaks and boosts, they would be reduced to 6 much more major and impactful changes. So, instead of 41 points, you're now given just 6 tiers, with a new point given every 15 levels from level 15 to level 90. Each tier presented 3 distinct options, which were usually active abilities, passives, or utility skills, and it let players pick one per tier, with the goal, as explained by the developers, for each decision to carry more weight and encouraging experimentation over this rigid optimization. They argued that the old system fell under that timeless problem that the game had since its launch. The freedom of choice it offered was really just an illusion, and most of the players fell under the same cookie-cutter builds. They further emphasized that their goal was to make each choice in this new tier system highly competitive and focusing on creating choice through preferred play styles rather than mindless optimization. Another benefit, they argued, was that this system also made switching specs much easier for the player, as they no longer required them to completely reinvest over 50 points just to make one single change, as the tiers can now be switched out on an independent basis. New features were also a staple of new expansions, of course, and Mists of Pandaria certainly wasn't lacking in them. The first being the pet battle system. What were once purely cosmetic pets were now designed to have more purpose with this Pokemon-inspired feature. Across Azeroth and Pandaria, players could now fight wild pets by battling them with their own, and if they wanted to, capture them to add them to their collection. Each pet had a type, like beast, elemental, or mechanical, with different strengths and weaknesses in this rock, paper, scissors style of format. The battles were turn-based, pitting teams of 3 pets against 3 wild creatures, either against NPCs or even other players. As for the pets themselves, they had 3 abilities chosen from a small pool, ranging from direct attacks like Bite to buffs or crowd controls, and this feature aimed for collectors and Pokemon fans alike. But getting into the more conventional features, there was also the new scenarios, essentially a new form of group content. Scenarios offered this bite-sized, story-driven experience for just 3 players. Similar to a dungeon, but were distinct in the fact that they weren't restricted to the rigidity of the 1 tank, 1 healer, and 3 DPS group makeup. This freedom ended up being their main draw, letting any combination of classes and roles to queue in. They're also much shorter, typically 10 to 20 minutes on average for a clean run, and they focused on key moments in the expansion story, aiming to immerse players in the conflict. Some examples would be defending a brewery from Sorak invaders, or perhaps Theramor's Fall, which depicted Garrosh's devastating mana bomb attack, a pivotal event that bridged the 2 expansions together. Each scenario had staged objectives. It would be things like defend a point, escort an NPC, or defeat a boss, and of course held rewards like gear, valor points, and reputation. Essentially, it was advertised as another way to progress without the commitment of raids or dungeons. But for those who weren't afraid of commitment, or challenge for that matter, awaited the Dungeon Challenge mode, which today you can think of as the first form of the Legion's Mythic Plus system. Having seen success with their splitting of the casual and hardcore raiding community with their heroic mode that they introduced in Wrath, they saw the same potential in the game's smaller 5-man content. At this point, heroic mode had pretty much lost its intense difficulty that it once had in the Burning Crusade expansion in its introduction, and dungeons really just existed solely as the stepping stone to raiding, rather than its own form of challenging content. However, with this new challenge mode system, it pushed skill and teamwork to the limit as they transformed the expansion's dungeons into these intense, timed trials for 5-player groups. Unlike regular dungeons, these modes scaled to the player's gear to a standardized item level, which stripped away the crutch of overpowered equipment, as success now hinged on coordination, strategy, and of course mastery of class mechanics, offering a pretty hardcore contrast to the casual appeal of other new features like scenarios and pet battles. Player performance was reflected with bronze, silver, and gold medals, which were awarded based on completion times. Gold runs demanded near perfect execution with optimized routes, crowd control, and high DPS, while at the same time avoiding wipes. Though it seemed as if Blizzard wasn't ready to go all in at this point, as the rewards were merely cosmetic. But at the same time, that didn't stop them from being quite coveted, as players scrambled for the unique armor and weapon transmogs and mounts, and also titles that showcased what for many was more important than any piece of gear: bragging rights. And last but certainly not least is a feature that's been mentioned a few times throughout this series, largely because it had such a huge impact on the core fundamentals of the game's community, and that's cross-realm zoning. This system let players from different servers appear on other servers and share outdoor zones, which made quiet areas feel alive with activity once more. It was certainly a technical leap in the game's history, and it aimed to ensure bustling quest hubs and dynamic events like rare spawns and world bosses feel vibrant and accessible, even on low population servers. But for many, the danger of losing their server community, or what little remained of it, would be a point of worry with this double-edged feature. So, feature after feature, changes, optimization, between its aesthetics and gameplay systems and even its community, it seemed like every corner of the game once again would receive sweeping updates and changes. In a way, it was the game's second Cataclysm. One major difference that it had, though, was, unlike the Cataclysm, the shadow of doubt was now ever present. Prior to the Cataclysm, World of Warcraft had 0 blemishes on their record, so the thought of an expansion that wasn't amazing was a foreign concept to the player base. However, now, with Cataclysm's controversial reception, players realized that Blizzard was indeed capable of faltering. Combining this with the wild change in environment and story, the shadow of doubt would be shrouded over mists right from the moment that it was announced, and Blizzard now found themselves in an unfamiliar environment, one where pessimism permeated like never before, as many eagerly awaited to see if the Mists of Pandaria could set it back on track to its former glory days. The day came, and Mists officially launched on September 25th, 2012, and signs of trouble showed early, as it was the first expansion since the game's launch in 2004 that failed to break sales records, selling still an impressive 2.7 million copies within the first 24 hours of release, but still far short of Cataclysm's 3.3 million. Though this was disappointing by World of Warcraft standards, it was still an astronomical number for the genre. The game saw a predictable surge of subscribers at its launch, and only time would tell if they would be able to retain this growth in any significant way as the players began to explore the expansion's various features. They ventured through the Jade Forest, they took part in the reinvigorated war between the Alliance and the Horde, they defended breweries, thwarted insectoid invaders, and they battled their way to the new maximum level, 90. Aesthetically, the expansion was a sight to behold, and this would be something that many would tout for years to come. After Cataclysm's dark and fiery devastation, Pandaria Zones offered a stark contrast with this vibrant escape, and although it was quite different than what fans were used to, it's especially praised today for its visual design, with some even calling it World of Warcraft's most beautiful expansion, even to this day. As for the new race, the Pandaren, as expected, it sparked a whirlwind of reactions, with some embracing this drastic shift, and others decrying it quite loudly, deeming it too cutesy and outrageous for what they were used to from the franchise. Like I mentioned, it remains to be a highly controversial topic even to this day. As for the new monk class, reactions were overall positive. All 3 specializations saw use, and they offered quite refreshing gameplay styles. The Brewmaster ended up being this AoE-centric tank class that excelled at kiting, which made them a standout for the game's new challenge mode. Their survivability was based around the stagger mechanic, which spread a percentage of physical damage taken over 10 seconds, and another ability called Purifying Brew, which cleared that stagger damage. They, like the Windwalker, operated on the energy and chi system, similar in some ways to the Rogue's combo points, where chi points are generated with builder abilities and then are spent with more powerful ones. Of course, for the Brewmaster, focusing more on mitigation and healing effects. Windwalker, on the other hand, was their melee DPS spec, focusing on martial arts, high mobility, as well as some crucial buffs and debuffs. As mentioned, kind of similar to the Rogue in some ways with its energy and chi system, as well as being an agility leather class. But they were certainly unique, and they centered more around buffs and debuffs, especially with their Tiger's Eye Brew, which gave them stacking damage and healing increases. As for the Mistweaver, which was their healing specialization, they focused on intellect leather, and in some ways similar to the philosophy of the Discipline Priest, where they healed through dealing damage, and also their Jade Serpent statue as a supporting healing turret. As for the new talent trees, similar to Cataclysm's revamp, they would see a mixed reaction. There were essentially 2 sides. Those who felt that the old system had no real choice, like the developers argued, as many of the nodes were either mandatory or filler. And on the other side, there are those who saw this new 6-tier system as less exciting and just another loss of the game's many RPG elements that were slowly being phased out. A point of praise was the increased flexibility, as players could now swap talents more easily, even while inside of dungeons and raids, which made things much more adaptable. Those of the latter side also argued that the leveling took a big hit in the feeling of progression, as you now only got a point every 15 levels instead of every 2 like in Cataclysm. And while the system aimed for parity, there were some underwhelming options in some tiers that left classes feeling quite homogenized, sparking debates whether if it was worth sacrificing complexity for convenience. As for the scenarios, they didn't really have as much impact as Blizzard had hoped. While the increased accessibility was certainly welcomed, they felt underwhelming to many, and they lacked the replayability compared to dungeon runs, feeling more like scripted quest content rather than some sort of endgame activity that they were marketed as. Blizzard would later address this by adding heroic modes, but as evidenced with the fact that they began and ended with mists, it wasn't as successful of a feature that they had hoped it would be. Those who preferred challenging small-scale content certainly weren't left disappointed, however, as the challenge mode ended up being its first evolution, earning widespread praise for its innovative design and focus on player skill. Critically, with its gear scaling mechanic, players were encouraged to strategize and optimize routes and chain pull, as opposed to just simply overpowering it with raiding gear, which is what usually happened with dungeons as the expansions went on. At this point, with how trivial Dungeon Heroics had become, there had definitely been a desire for challenging 5-man content, and, aptly named, Challenge Mode delivered really well on this front, with really the only main criticism being that the rewards were only cosmetic, as Blizzard still had this apprehension, and they wanted raiding to be their primary mainstay method of obtaining the best gear. As history would show, they would finally acquiesce in the Legion expansion with the next evolution, Mythic Plus, but Challenge Mode was an important precedent, and it was successful enough that it would be carried into the next expansion, the Warlords of Draenor. Following the theme with their preceding expansions, raiding once again saw a pretty fundamental change in design. As you know if you saw the Wrath of the Lich King episode, it saw this huge evolution by splitting up the hardcore and casual audiences with the introduction of heroic mode, where normal mode was toned down to be much easier, and those seeking a challenge were funneled into the much more challenging heroic difficulty. This was taken a step further in the Cataclysm expansion with the 3rd difficulty mode, LFR, and when the Siege of Orgrimmar launched in patch 5.4, it released with the Flex mode, which scaled difficulty based on the amount of players. This was another huge accessibility and convenience change, as guilds that had absences in their roster no longer had to find fill-ins or run raids undermanned. And speaking of raiding, Mists is also when the game first saw rollable loot in their Throne of Thunder raid. items could roll higher eye levels called Thunder Forging, which aimed to add replayability and longevity to the raids between tiers. And while it would be relatively tame at the time, as you would know if you saw the Legion episode, this would eventually grow out of control with Titan Forging, which greatly increased the ceiling of how high an item level could roll, as well as doing it for every item in the game as opposed to just one single raid tier. And while this would add much excitement to the game, it also made luck have much more of a say in the game's reward structure, which certainly rubbed some people the wrong way. Speaking of the raiding, as was standard, the team was on top of their game. The raids and their fights were as fun and as engaging as ever, with the Throne of Thunder today is often regarded as being a fan favorite not only for the actual fights, but also for its visual design, and really reinforced that the expansion was a treat to look at. Most of the criticisms would come from its final raid, the Siege of Orgrimmar, and not really with any of the fights themselves as much as its intense length. It held 14 bosses total, and some felt like it dragged on just a bit too long. The PvP, many say, was also in a really good spot. In fact, many even refer to Mists as, quote, the PvP expansion. While nothing is ever perfect, gone were the days of vanilla where certain specs were just plain useless. Each felt like they had something to contribute in Battlegrounds or Arena, while at the same time hitting that sweet spot before the negative effects of homogenization had started to set in. As for their esports, at this point they were setting new records in BlizzCon, and the overall sentiment today is that it hit a high point, getting into the more negatively received features, and this would be something that peaked in BFA and technically started with the Burning Crusade with the Isle of Koldanas, but Mist's heavy reliance on daily quests and the resulting fear of missing out, or FOMO, became a very defining and often criticized aspect of the expansion. There certainly wasn't a shortage of reputations in Mists, and the rewards they offered were viewed as mandatory by many in the gearing process for raiding. They offered access to epic gear and patterns behind these daily quest hubs, which required weeks of grinding to reach Exalted. And it was at this point that players now more than ever felt the sting of FOMO, as skipping dailies meant essentially falling behind, especially early on in the expansion when raid progression more demanded these rewards. The sheer volume, with sometimes dozens of quests per zone and limited daily resets, created this quite relentless cycle, and it was amplified by this need to juggle multiple factions simultaneously to stay competitive. And it really marked the beginning of this very intense period where you wouldn't feel rewarded for playing as much as you would feel punished for not playing, blurring the entire reason for video games' existence to begin with. It's for fun. It's this optional side recreational activity to enjoy with zero obligation to play other than for the fun of it. As patches released, they eased the grind by adding catch-up mechanics and reducing reputation requirements, but this early period of daily quest overload certainly left a lasting mark, which players are currently experiencing and griping about in the recent re-release. As for the pet battles, this was quite a unique case. Most people didn't really have any issue with the system itself. It worked exactly as described. Players could use vanity pets and level them and battle and capture critters from around the world, and it was a fairly large step in the game's approach to collections and side activities, and is proven by the success of Pokemon, which is the highest grossing IP in history. The formula worked. Most who criticized it didn't really have a problem with the system itself, as much as the simple fact that it existed, and it really tied into the expansion's major downfall, even today over a decade later, and that's, for many, in their eyes, it simply wasn't World of Warcraft. It's similar to, say, in the original Star Wars trilogy, instead of the big finale in Episode 6, it was instead a Western starring Clint Eastwood, with none of the original cast returning. I think most would agree that Westerns starring Clint Eastwood are pretty cool. It's just not Star Wars. And the game today in many ways represents something more of a Pixar movie than it does this original, gritty, violent, heavy metal world that it originated from. And Pandaria was the first taste of this transformation. And part of the issue is that the very previous expansion, the Cataclysm, had already given the game this complete makeover, both aesthetically and mechanically. Those who adapted to it were just getting used to its sweeping changes, and then all of a sudden, pandas. It was certainly a very jarring series of changes in the game's history, and as we've learned over the years, there's a large contingency of the MMO population that is quite resistant to change. It's become a comfort game for many, the sort of getaway from the unpredictability of life in general, a world they can retreat to where they feel like they're in control and are very familiar with. Change is inevitable, and as long as it's moving in the right direction, it's a good thing. But for many, between these two expansions, this home away from home was essentially violently ripped away from them and replaced with something that, compared to just a couple of years prior, was almost unrecognizable. If you put a player in stasis during the middle of Wrath, and then you wake them up for BlizzCon 2012, they would be pretty confused. People seriously thought that it was an April Fool's joke, which I suppose wasn't helped by the fact that they had used pandering in the past for actual April Fool's jokes. Perhaps it was made in an attempt to appeal to Eastern audiences. Some also theorized that its focus on FOMO and dailies were brought upon by the pressure of people dropping computer games for mobile gaming, and others say with its overall cutesy aesthetic and things such as a Pokemon-inspired pet battling system, they're trying to appeal to a younger audience. Whatever the case is, for many it just felt like an expansion that was aimed at everyone but fans of Warcraft. I think in a vacuum, most would agree that Mists is a pretty good expansion. It had all of the features and the fixings of what people expected from a Blizzard expansion at that point, with a good amount of polish as this cherry on top. People today praise the class balance. Many felt that they hit this sweet spot where both PvE and PvP felt really smooth and organic and fair and just fun. For the most part, nothing is ever perfect, of course. The raids, as usual, were as great as ever, and most criticisms were tied to the multiple difficulties rather than the raids themselves. The expansion today is especially praised for its visual beauty with its zones, and in its own world, it was a good expansion. However, it was and is controversial today because for many, it simply wasn't the game that initially drew them in. It wasn't World of Warcraft, and this is reflected with its subscriber count, which only continued this downward trend that started with the Cataclysm. Some say that it's shallow to write off an entire expansion based on the world and theme alone, which is ironic because this statement itself is quite shallow. At the end of the day, an MMORPG is part RPG. The story and the world are half the game, and this is especially true during this point in its life. Ever since Wrath, when they started weaving in these in-game cutscenes and introducing main antagonists and weaving plots and subplots together, the story and the world had become such a huge part of the game. It's part of the developer's job to know their player base and know what they want, and if they're so far off with their story and world that people are actually willing to completely disregard an otherwise pretty good expansion, the fault lies with the developers, not the players, because there is such a large fundamental disconnect. And whenever you start going for other audiences, you run the risk of losing your original audience, and I'm sure this was something that they were very well aware of in the making of this expansion. In fact, they were quite well aware of this, as the very next expansion, The Warlords of Draenor, was essentially a return to its roots. The entire marketing campaign for Draenor was to go back to the good old days, back through the Dark Portal to the Outland in Draenor before it was corrupted by the Burning Legion. I think that they recognized that they went so far away from their original design that they did this complete 180 to the past, and while Draenor today is considered a dud for many reasons, its environment and theme of the expansion isn't one of them, and it's evidenced quite clearly with this insane surge on release. Draenor was possibly one of their most hyped expansions ever, and it saw this huge surge in subscribers at the end of Pandaria. And a big reason for that was that it was advertised to be returning to what World of Warcraft once was. Orcs, axes, violence, and war. And you have to look no further than the comparison of these release surges between the Mists of Pandaria and Draenor. Regardless, by the end of Pandaria, private servers, which had really started picking up steam in Cataclysm, saw this huge explosion of popularity. and that would steadily rise all the way through Legion, which is when Blizzard caved in and announced Classic, which, ironically enough, today has gone down the very same path that led to the desire to play it to begin with, but that's a story for another video. I'll see you in the next episode, where we'll be covering the Shadowlands.
Farewell for now, mortals. We hope you enjoyed today's video. See you again soon.